Thank you, Sarah. And I was really looking forward to meeting you all in person, but obviously that didn't turn out right. So I'm zooming in from my house in Raleigh. Our university is also closed, North Carolina State University. So in the time I have with you today, I'm going to talk mostly about a National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine report that came out just over a year ago called Forest Health and Biotechnology. I was on that committee, and I'll tell you a little bit about that committee, and I'll go through some of the findings of that report. And then at the end of the presentation, I just want to give you all a sense of the research I've done as a social scientist interested in the case of the genetically engineered American chestnut tree. And so I'll mention just a little bit of the work that I've done there, mostly to give you a sense of what I've done and point to some resources, but I'll focus my presentation on the report. So the National Academies puts together expert committees to look at particular kinds of issues. And our committee was looking at the potential for biotechnology to address forest health. And I just want to call your attention to the diversity of expertise on this committee. We had a lot of different kinds of experts on the committee, and that's by design because we want to look at problems and solutions in a really comprehensive way. And so as I mentioned, I'm a social scientist. I'm located at NC State University in the Department of Forestry and Environmental Resources. And I'm also part of the Genetic Engineering and Society Center. And I'm a social scientist who studies scientific controversies, especially around emerging biotechnologies and issues of public engagement and stakeholder engagement. So this is just to give you a sense of the committee. What was the impetus for this study? The National Academies is basically hired to do studies by different parts of the government, different agencies. The reason we were asked to conduct the study was that we understand that healthy forests sustain ecosystems over time and space, and that provides value to human beings. But that forest health is certainly threatened by invasive pests and exacerbated by climate change, as Mark mentioned to us in the last presentation. It's important to recognize that our existing regulatory system has not yet reviewed biotech plants to be released into unmanaged forest ecosystems. So most of us know that we have genetically engineered crops on most of the farmland in the US, but we haven't been reviewing biotech plants or trees in particular to be released into unmanaged forest systems. As many of you are probably aware, that has recently changed with the genetically engineered American chestnut tree being submitted to be reviewed by our regulatory system just within the last month or two. And lastly, that the public sector plays an important role in protecting forest health. And so that was the focus of our study. We defined forest health in a particular way. So we described it as a condition that sustains the structure, composition, processes, function, and productivity and resilience of forest ecosystems over time and space. And that's a kind of scientific technical definition, but it's important we also included that this assessment is based on the current state of knowledge and can be influenced by human needs, cultural values, and land management objectives. So what's important to take away from this is that forest health is not something that we can codify in the scientific literature as absolute. It's something that changes with our own understanding and our own values. Our report talks about the increasing threats to forest health. And so one of those threats is insect pests and pathogens. This is just a map of the estimates of loss of 25% or more of tree vegetation over the next, well, about 20 years, starting in 2013. Those red marks suggest major tree loss because of insect pests and pathogens. So these threats are definitely increasing. One of the ways that we track this kind of threat of pests and pathogens is by introductions. And I'm going to go over quite a bit of this information fairly quickly, but I'll just try to highlight some of the things that I think are most interesting. The frequency of introductions of phloem and wood borers has been increasing rapidly. And so that's one of the major parts of non-native insect pests coming into the US and threatening our forests. It wouldn't be a problem if our native forests and trees had evolved resistance to these insect pests and pathogens, but there's a lack of resistance because our trees didn't evolve with those same pests. And so as most of you know, the emerald ash borer has been wreaking havoc on ash trees. And the reason for that is that ash trees didn't evolve in an environment where the emerald ash borer was active. And so they are very susceptible to this novel insect pest. And to go along with what Mark described, our report talks about synergistic effects of climate change. And so with warmer winters and fewer cold spells and longer active seasons for pests, that kind of warming is a very hospitable environment for many pests and pathogens. And so the graphs A, B, and C just show the estimated development of spruce beetle in a single year in North American spruce forests over different periods of time. And with greater warming, we see a much higher level of development of spruce beetle in a single year because of predicted climate change. We also recognize that it's not just a single threat for many trees. So as you all know well, the chestnut is vulnerable to both chestnut blight and also root rot. We also looked at whitebark pine as an example, which is threatened by white pine blister rust and the mountain pine beetle. So the threats are complex and they can be synergistic. Our report looked at 4 different case studies for thinking about how could biotechnology potentially be useful in improving forest health for particular species. So we looked at poplar, ash, whitebark pine, and your favorite, the American chestnut. And so I don't need to take any time to mention this case study. You all know this one well. The next case that we looked at was whitebark pine, which is a very different kind of species. It's a kind of keystone species in particular ecosystems, and it's threatened by white pine blister rust. We also looked at ash, which Mark mentioned as well, is threatened by the emerald ash borer, and that population of insects is moving across the landscape rapidly. We looked at poplars partly because we wanted to look at a tree that is also used for plantation forestry. So one of the reasons we chose our case studies was to get a diversity of kinds of trees in terms of ecosystems, regions, and also the human values that we place on trees. And the particular example we looked at was canker disease for poplar. And I'm not going to go into detail with these 4 case studies, but I just wanted to call your attention to them. If you're interested in these cases, you can read more about them in the report that is published, and I'll show a URL to the free PDF at the end of this presentation if you'd like to find that. We also have a summary report that's much shorter if you'd like to reference that. Our report, one of the things that we concluded that's really important is that in terms of curtailing attacks from insect pests and pathogens, the costs go up over time. So prevention and eradication early on in the species introduction are the most efficient ways to deal with invading pests and pathogens. As they become established in our environment, they're going to spread and grow further, and the control costs go up. And so the point of this slide is that our committee concluded that one of the most important things to think about for forest health is the prevention of invasive pests and pathogens. So what about using biotechnology to mitigate threats to forest health? And I'll just mention that we focused fairly narrowly on the potential to genetically engineer trees to deal with forest health challenges. There are also really interesting possibilities of using biotechnology on, for example, on the pests or pathogens themselves, whether that's insects or fungi. But we focused, because of the sponsor of the report request, we focused on genetically engineered or biotech trees. And there has been some examples, as you all certainly know one of them. There are several tree species that have been altered with biotechnology for forest health purposes. 2 examples here are the transgenic American chestnut, as you know, which hasn't been released widely yet, but has been put out in field trials. There has also been poplar trees that have been transformed with a method for them to produce their own pesticide, BT, which is also common with soybeans and corn as a technique to control pests. But none of these trees have yet been deregulated and released into the wild. So field trials have occurred, but we haven't seen widespread release. Our report identified a number of challenges of using biotechnology. One of those is that we don't have full knowledge about the mechanisms of pest resistance in trees, and this is complicated. So the BT trait is a fairly simple solution for the plant to create its own pesticide. The transgenic American chestnut offers a kind of blight protection to the tree. But for other types of insect pests and pathogens, pest resistance is really complicated and not always so simple. Trees have a large genome size and a long lifespan. So it's important to recognize that we have lots of biotechnology products in agricultural crops and for medical biotechnology and bacteria and other small cells, but trees grow a long time. And so our research enterprise of faculty and students at universities, it's challenging for us to take on a project around a biotech tree that we can't grow it to full adult size in a greenhouse. The lifespan of a tree is much longer than a graduate student career. And so some of those logistic factors really have an impact in using biotech for these challenges. We have a lack of information on the effects of releasing new genotypes into the environment. We can use some modeling and look to some other comparative cases through biocontrol, but we haven't yet done this. And so we have some uncertainty around the release of new genotypes. Lastly, that there's a need for resistant trees to be suitably adapted to specific environments. So as Mark just said, trees have ranges, southern ranges and northern ranges, for example. And so, a BT poplar tree isn't going to do well in the entire range of poplar. We may need to transform multiple subspecies of poplar for success in a broad environment. And that's a challenge for forest biotechnology as well. So some of the recommendations that we made was the importance of investing in identifying or introducing resistance into tree species that are threatened by insects and pathogens, that we need to understand the fundamental mechanisms of resistance to pests and how trees adapt to diverse environments under a changing climate, and that if we are going to deploy biotech in the pursuit of forest health, that we need to understand range-wide patterns of the distribution of standing genetic variation. This is really important, that when we transform a particular plant with a desired trait, that's only one part of the genetic diversity that exists. We don't want to lose the standing genetic variation of forest trees that are out there that may be adapted to the particular region or particular kinds of pests or pathogens that are already present in the environment. So local adaptation is really important for us to consider when we think about using biotechnology. There's some interesting work to identify resistant trees within a population that have survived a pest outbreak. So these are just some data from one of the committee members that I served with. With Whitebark Pine, there's a test of different families of Whitebark Pine to their resistance to blister rust. And there does seem to be some existing genetic variation that offers protection against white pine blister rust. In addition, there's some really interesting work done on what is called lingering ash. What does that mean? It means, what about the ash trees that seem to be left over after the emerald ash borer moves through a population? There does seem to be some genetic resistance to emerald ash borer in ash trees. It's not a kind of silver bullet solution, but that kind of standing genetic variation that offers resistance is something that we want to make sure that we take advantage of and notice as we think about biotechnology as a possible solution as well. So we want to understand the role of resistance in co-evolved systems from the perspective of a global host pest system. So thinking about where did the emerald ash borer come from and what is its relationship to trees there, and how have those trees evolved with that pest in the environment. We also need to think about whether resistance will persist in trees that are expected to live for decades. So again, trees are different than agricultural crops that are just supposed to live for one growing season. So the kind of traits that we might introduce through biotechnology, we need to think about their longevity and the way that they can persist in trees over time. We talked about the importance of thinking about impact assessment as a kind of decision framework that considers trade-offs among positive, negative, and neutral impacts of these kinds of interventions. So the problem is big, but if the solutions are uncertain, we need to think about a kind of impact assessment framework. So we wanted to, in our report, we talked about the importance of considering the ecological risks to forest systems, as well as what we called ecosystem services that might be lost or maintained with or without forest health. And we talked about how that field trials are really essential for us to understand the potential gene flow of forest tree species, the durability and effectiveness of resistance, as I mentioned before, the possibility of seed generation and dispersal through the environment, the genetic fitness of new varieties that we might release, and ecosystem impacts. We recommended that federal agencies should continue to improve the incorporation of ecosystem services into an integrated impact assessment. And the graph on the right is a kind of adaptive management way of thinking about ecosystem services in terms of a kind of circular process of monitoring, evaluating, adjusting the kinds of interventions that we might introduce to the environment. Modeling can be very useful in terms of understanding or predicting questions around biotech tree gene flow, dispersal, establishment, performance. And that may be really necessary when the flowering of field trial material is restricted. And so right now, the framework that we have in the United States to regulate potential biotechnology plants is that the flowering of a field trial is very restricted in most cases. And that's because we don't want the escape of a new kind of genetic material until we're ready to approve that. That poses a challenge to biotech trees because how do we understand those types of dynamics if a tree isn't allowed to flower? And I understand talking to some of the scientists on the Chestnut project that they had to get very special permission from the USDA to allow some of their field trial trees to flower. And they had to monitor that flowering very carefully, but it was important for them to do that to understand how those trees could behave if they were released more widely. We emphasized the importance of identifying and understanding sources of uncertainty, even in our modeling, and the importance of an adaptive management approach to forest health to ensure that we continue to learn and address impacts to both the environment and society. We did emphasize that it's not just about investing in technology. We need to invest in human capital to understand issues of tree breeding, forest ecology, and rural sociology. So it's not just about the genetic engineering. Any sort of biotech solution to a forest health problem will need a very careful tree breeding effort, an understanding of forest ecology, and social scientists on the ground as well to understand how that innovation will be received and perceived by broader public audiences as well. You know, it's really important to think about this difference. This is just a contrast here. So on the right, I have a picture from the Arctic apple website. Arctic apples are an approved genetically engineered tree that are designed to produce a non-browning apple. But these are these are almost like agriculture. These orchards are more like agriculture than a wild forest. And so it's important to recognize that biotech trees for forest health are designed to spread and persist in unmanaged environments. And that's a very different kind of ecology and environment, and also in terms of how the public perceives these interventions, it's very different from, for example, an apple orchard. And so we talked in our report about how the values around forest trees extend beyond an ecosystem services framework that might focus just on, for example, soil health or water availability and things like that. So we talked about how trees have intrinsic value to many people, and those may be a kind of spiritual value, or for some Native American communities that we spoke with, there's an understanding of trees as kin. So kinship relationships between forests and people are a different kind of way of valuing trees and forest ecosystems than a strict ecosystem services framework would allow. We also talked about the value of wildness in forests and how biotech trees raise questions about how we define wildness and what's important in a wild, unmanaged forests. And we talked about in our report the importance of thinking about social justice, which raises questions about the distribution of benefits and costs across a landscape of people. procedural justice, which means how do we make decisions that might be controversial, and intergenerational concerns. You know, when we think about planting a biotech tree, this is something that will be affecting not just our current generation, but future generations as well. And so how do we take responsibility for that? For our report, we did quite an extensive review of studies on public attitudes about forest biotechnology. And I obviously don't have time today to talk through all those studies that we looked at. There's relatively few studies about biotech trees compared to GM food, for example. Most of the surveys that were done are from Europe or Canada. And so there hasn't been that much work that's been done in the US, although there has been some. But I just want to call your attention to one study that I think is particularly interesting. This was a study that just came out in 2018, looking at, for example, if you look at the bottom row, which is reforestation with GMOs, and the level of support for that. It's a lot lower than things like natural regeneration or local tree breeding, where there seems to be a great deal of success. But what's really interesting is, you know, you might look at this data and think, oh, well, the public doesn't want GMOs, and so we shouldn't even consider biotech trees. Well, if you look closely at the data, it's kind of interesting because the levels of support or concern were pretty close with the reforestation with non-native species. So this is not a genetically engineered tree. This is a non-native species. What do we make of this? It means that there's something more complicated going on than simply pro-biotech or anti-biotech. People have really sophisticated understandings of how they value forests and what forest health means and the importance of dealing with, for example, pests and pathogens that might threaten the health of their forest. So I just show this slide as a reminder that it's more complicated than simply pro-GMO or anti-GMO, which is kind of what we see in the media most times. So our committee talked about the importance of that we need not just more research in the genetics of trees and the ecology of trees, but also about the social responses to biotech trees for forest health. We need to understand how different social and cultural groups might respond to these possibilities. We need to understand how these attitudes might be stable or not stable over time for different kinds of applications and circumstances. And some of the survey data, for example, shows that there's more enthusiasm for a biotech tree that would respond to something like climate change or a pest threat, and less enthusiasm for something that would simply be designed to increase growth rates for plantation forestry. We also want to understand how attitudes might differ between different biotechnology strategies. So you may have heard of CRISPR, which is the relatively new gene editing tool. There's older techniques of transgenic trees. There's also the possibility of what's called cisgenesis, which is using biotechnology to insert genes that could have been put into a particular subspecies with crossbreeding. So it's basically genetic material from the same species. Other surveys have shown that those types of different biotech tools have an impact on how people perceive the wisdom of a particular technology. There's deeper value orientations that we need to understand, as I mentioned, around wildness or naturalness that play a role here. And those raise some questions around trade-offs and how people make trade-offs between, for example, the wildness of a place and protecting a species that they care about. And our committee also talked about the need for engagement of stakeholders and publics, that this kind of engagement needs to be respectful, transparent, and inclusive as we consider these types of interventions. This helps us understand the importance of forest health threats and can help create a public dialogue around this issue, which you all probably know quite well, but the average American doesn't understand very well. This kind of engagement can uncover complex public responses to any kind of potential interventions, including biotechnology. So lots of interventions that we might make to protect forest health might be controversial and concerning in terms of cost or off-target ecological impacts, things like that. And our committee emphasized the importance of what are called analytical deliberative methods that would engage stakeholders, communities, and the public. And on the right is the cover of a workshop report a workshop that I led that I'll talk a little bit about later in the presentation about the genetically engineered American chestnut tree as an example of this kind of deliberative method. So I'll briefly just mention something about our report also addressed the regulatory system for biotech trees and also thinking about how our regulatory system addresses forest health more broadly. Our task was to determine how well our current regulatory system in the US takes forest health into account and to compare that process with how well forest health is addressed for non-biotech interventions as well. Just to be clear, we were not tasked with analyzing the current biotech regulatory system and making a bunch of recommendations for how that should be improved, but there are other recent National Academies reports that dealt with, had in their task was more specific recommendations to alter the regulatory framework. But what are a couple of important takeaways from our study? One is that the current regulatory system for biotech plants does apply to biotech forest trees and doesn't impose any additional requirements. And it's also true that because of new techniques of genetic editing like CRISPR, there are some biotech plants that would not be regulated by one or more agencies, and that is the case also for biotech trees. So some biotech trees that we might consider biotechnology created trees for forest health could be commercialized or released without federal oversight because of the way our regulatory system is set up. We also concluded that our regulatory system encapsulates very few of our comprehensive definition of forest health. And so our regulatory system was primarily set up to deal with more traditional agricultural and environmental impacts of biotechnology. So thinking about plant pests and soil quality and things like that. We didn't set up our regulatory system for biotechnology in the 1980s thinking about forest trees. We did note, though, that if a detailed environmental assessment or environmental impact statement is required to be completed by an agency with oversight over a biotech tree, then some of the components of forest health that we identified could be analyzed. But we noted, too, that environmental assessments and or environmental impact statements are only completed for a subset of biotechnology currently. We also noted, and this is important too, that it's not like our regulatory system is doing an incredible job for non-biotech products. So thinking about biological control agents or pesticides or decisions around assisted migration of forest trees, those regulations that oversee those types of activities also don't consider forest health in a more general way. And so the regulatory picture is somewhat problematic, but is problematic for a lot of different interventions and not just a deficiency around biotechnology. So that's most of what I wanted to cover for the report. I'll just mention that I was asked to write a short piece for The Conversation, which is a kind of online magazine. Often professors and other types of researchers are asked to contribute short pieces that describe their research in language that's more accessible to the public than a 200-page National Academy of Sciences report. So this is something that's available online. It's just a couple of pages. And if you're interested in reading that, that might be something to share with other people, family members or friends who might want to understand our National Academy's report in terms of what it's answering this question of, can genetic engineering save disappearing forests? I think the major takeaway is that it's really complicated, that biotechnology may play a role, but it's not a silver bullet solution. It's not a solution for every forest health problem, and it's something that we'll need to invest in a lot of different disciplines of expertise and science in order to do this well and to minimize risks. And as I promised, this is the slide that tells you where to find this report. All National Academy of Sciences report are free to download as PDFs, and that's a really nice service of this agency. A number of different organizations sponsored our study: USDA, Forest Service, the EPA, and also the US Endowment for Forestry and Communities. And so if you're interested in more details about that report, you can find that information there. And I think I'm doing pretty well on time. I wanted to spend just a few minutes telling you about my work as a researcher specifically on the genetically modified American chestnut tree. So I'm a social scientist, as I mentioned. I'm interested in scientific controversies that intersect with the public. And a number of years ago, I learned about Bill Powell's work at SUNY ESF around the genetically engineered American chestnut tree. And I just thought, what an interesting case. And it's interesting to me for all sorts of reasons. It's applying biotechnology for species restoration. It was interesting to me that the scientists weren't seeking patents or trying to commercialize the technology. The other reason it was interesting to me is that this is a biotechnology product that's aimed at conservation or environmental good. And a lot of the opposition to biotechnology has been from environmental activists and within the environmental movement. And so as a researcher, I was really interested to see, how will this unfold? How will this be seen by different environmentalists and other broader publics and stakeholders as a potential solution to the loss of a species that was valued by many people for many different reasons. And so I applied for a grant from the National Science Foundation, and my collaborators and I were awarded a grant to study this case. I won't go into details of all the work that we've done, but I just wanted to give you a sense of sort of the approach of a social scientist who thinks about this particular technology. And the figure on the left there with the tree and the tree rings, that was the figure that we used to describe our grant to the NSF. We wanted to look at the biotechnologists who are doing the work, but also at broader public audiences, the role of non-governmental organizations, which include environmental organizations, as well as the American Chestnut Foundation and other groups. And we also took the time to engage explicitly with indigenous stakeholders, so Native American communities who are on the historic habitat of the American chestnut tree and who live near some of the field trials and potential release sites. So what I'll do is, I just have a couple more slides to show you. Essentially, I just want to show you the slides of some of the publications that have come out of my research group. So I worked with a group of PhD students and postdocs over the last couple of years, as well as a partnership with the Center for Native Peoples and the Environment at SUNY ESF. And so that was the Native American component of our research. So one publication that was led by my PhD student, Jessica Cavan-Barnes, addresses the question that was raised at the beginning in terms of the impact of climate change on the chestnut. And so I know that these graphs are a little bit small, but perhaps that you can see on the right here. My student basically did a little bit of GIS modeling, looking at the likely suitable habitat for American chestnut with different scenarios of climate change over the next 60, 70 years. And so what you see on the right are, if you look at the sort of, there's two columns. Down the left column is a certain set of scenarios for climate change starting in 2030, going to 2050, and then to 2080. And the green areas are the parts that are suitable habitat for the American chestnut. And you can see a slight kind of migration north of the suitable habitat. She looked at issues of predicted temperature and also precipitation. One could also look at things like forest soil types and things like that. I don't think that was part of her models. But the more extreme scenarios for climate change, so this is on the right-hand side, again, 2030, 2050, and 2080, show a more extreme movement of the suitable habitat for American chestnut north of its historic range. So the outlined area that you see is what we understand as the historic range of the American chestnut. And so what's really interesting about that bottom right figure is that a lot of the best habitat under these predictions for American chestnut will move north out of the historic range of the American chestnut tree. And so that raises really interesting questions about how we think about restoring a species that might not do well in its historic habitat. And so I think this was an interesting paper to start that conversation. And one of the conclusions that she made in her paper was that this model demonstrates that the goals of assisted evolution projects, which is where we're trying to think about rescuing trees that might be subject to climate change, they often aim to maintain species in their native ranges, but we need to account for the uncertainty and novelty of future environmental conditions as we think about restoring species or protecting species from these kinds of changes. Another paper that was written by a different graduate student focused on our engagement with some of the indigenous stakeholders that we worked with. So we conducted interviews and meetings with people in the Haudenosaunee people, which is in Upper New York State. We worked some with the Haudenosaunee Environmental Task Force to create some dialogues with them, and also with Bill Powell and his team at SUNY ESF. And so this is a paper that looked at the ways that restoration of the American chestnut is understood and perceived by people in those communities. And a second paper along those same themes, again led by my student Katie Barnhill-Dilling, looking at this understanding of, you all may know the term environmental justice. There's also a sort of subfield of that called indigenous environmental justice, and thinking about how do we understand indigenous environmental justice and the potential restoration of the American chestnut tree. And, I'll just call attention to a really interesting aspect here, which is, when our regulatory system, for example, approves a biotechnology tree, that biotech tree obviously isn't going to respect our political boundaries. And so one of the things that I understand from the application for the approval of the American chestnut tree is that there's already conversations with Canadian regulatory agencies, understanding that this tree over time might likely move into Canada as well. Well, we have a number of sovereign borders within our country as well, around sovereign indigenous nations. And so Native American communities also have a sovereign right over managing their landscapes. And so one of the driving questions for us as researchers was thinking about, what does it mean for our US regulatory system to make decisions about a tree that could then spread onto Native American land where it may or may not be desired? And how do we intersect with those governing processes to do that in a respectful and responsible way? And I mentioned this before, but one of the really neat parts of our project was that we were able to host a stakeholder workshop at NC State University almost 2 years ago. And this was part of our effort to do engagement work around the tree and not just study it. And our motivations for holding this workshop, one was to think about bringing together a diverse group of stakeholders and the innovators themselves. And so we thought it was really important that Bill Powell and his graduate student who's done a lot of the work, Andy Newhouse, were both at this workshop, as well as a number of other kinds of stakeholders around this issue. And we also wanted to expand beyond what's in my field called upstream public engagement. And so what do I mean by that? Sometimes people talk about the importance of upstream engagement for an emerging technology, that we need to engage broader publics and stakeholders early on in the design process so that they can have an impact on how a particular technology is designed. Well, for the American chestnut tree, the genetically engineered version is largely already designed. It's been tested in laboratories and in field trials. And so in a sense, it will be ready to go if it is approved by our regulatory institutions. But we wanted to think about a broader set of decision-making that will surround this technology moving forward. And so the importance of engaging stakeholders in discussions about the decisions that we will make about this tree going forward. And just to give you a sense of the diversity of stakeholders we had at the workshop, your organization was represented, although it was unfortunate we conflicted with an important senior level meeting for your foundation. So we didn't have Sarah, for example, or Jared were unable to come, but we had other people from your organization. We had folks from ArborGen, which is one of the industrial players in the biotech tree space. We also had someone from the Global Justice Ecology Project who runs the Stop GE Trees campaign. We had Indigenous representatives from the Center for Native Peoples and the Environment, people from the Nature Conservancy, someone from Chestnut Growers, Forest Service, and a number of other organizations. And it's just important to note that this was a very diverse group of people, and there were existing disagreements in the room. And so part of our motivation there was to bring this diversity of people together to have a productive conversation. And I'll just give you a quick sense of what we did at the workshop. We talked about different decision phases for this, this technology, this tree, that certainly currently we're in a regulatory review phase, but that if it is approved, there will be this other phase that we call deployment, management, and monitoring. And a lot of important decisions will be made about how this tree makes its way into the environment, how we manage it, how we monitor the impacts. And those decisions are important to make open to a diverse set of stakeholders as well. And that there may be future phases of research and development, either for the American chestnut tree, for example, for Phytophthora, root rot, or for other trees for forest health. We emphasize the importance of indigenous perspectives on chestnut restoration and biotech. So we had a lunchtime speaker who also presented to our National Academies study. We focused on the importance of airing the interests and values in the room and respecting people's different perspectives in that sense. We had a presentation about public perceptions, a scholar at Oregon State University, Mark Needham, who was also served on the National Academies Committee with me. And we talked about the different kinds of questions and different types of knowledge that would be important for these different decision phases. And we ended with getting this group of people to talk about what are ideal engagement scenarios. And what I mean by that is, how might we expand beyond just a small workshop at NC State, but engaging broader publics and stakeholders across the landscape, across the country, as we consider this, this really novel tree. And I just want to let you know that we did write a workshop report, which is freely available at the Genetic Engineering and Society website. And so if you're interested in learning more about the workshop, the kinds of conversations we had, it wasn't a workshop that was designed to create consensus among the stakeholders invited. That would have been a very big challenge. But we did have some really productive conversations, and I'd encourage you to take a look at our report if you're interested in that. And I will end there and just mention that, again, that I'm part of the Genetic Engineering and Society Center, and our mission is to integrate scientific knowledge and public values in shaping the futures of biotechnology. And so I hope you can see how my work around biotechnology and forest health and the American chestnut in particular is a perfect project for my participation in that center. Thanks very much for your attention.
Jason, thanks so much for that excellent presentation. We've got a couple of good questions, and before I field those, I do want to remind people, if you want to ask a question, you can text me, you can email Hoy, you can enter the Zoom chat. And also, I know that we're going to be having the recording of this webinar up, so you gave some amazing links, Jason, so I want to make sure that people know that they'll be able to review that. And also, we'll talk later about making sure we can get a PDF or some other format for folks to have those for reference.
Absolutely. I'm happy to share that.
Great. Thanks, Jason. So with that, I'm going to ask a couple questions that folks have put in. So Jim Eckert asks, is there any indication of what direction our regulatory bodies will decide? Do you think they'll allow or prohibit the transgenic American chestnut?
I don't have that crystal ball. I think, you know, so I really don't know what's going to happen. I think there are reasons to be optimistic that it would be approved. One is that I think, you know, the scientists who are putting forth this application have done, from what I understand, some really thoughtful ecological tests of understanding what the impact of this tree would be in the environment. And those studies are part of the application. So I think that's, you know, that's been careful work. You know, there hasn't yet been a forest tree that's been approved, though. And so it is a new kind of consideration for our regulatory system. You know, a cautionary tale, I think, is the transgenic salmon. There was incredible enthusiasm around this genetically engineered fish 10, 20 years ago. And it took a long time for it to weave its way through the regulatory system because it posed new kinds of issues. And it also created real public controversy. So, you know, I don't think that doesn't mean that that's exactly what's going to happen to the American chestnut tree application, but it's a kind of cautionary tale that, you know, this is not just a scientific issue. This is also a political issue. And I would argue it should be, because the meaning of the genetically engineered American chestnut tree is not simply reducible to the way that it operates ecologically. It also operates in our social and human systems in important ways. And so there are important reasons to be very excited about this tree. And I think there are some legitimate concerns and questions around the tree from a more social perspective. The last thing I'll just say is that, we are also living in a time when the focus is on reducing regulatory burden. And so all of our agencies, all of our oversight agencies are being encouraged from the very highest levels to reduce the regulatory burden and to allow new technologies and products through the system. And so in one sense, this is a very opportune time for this application to go in. It will be reviewed by the USDA, the EPA, and the FDA. It's one of the reasons it's also a really interesting regulatory case is because the chestnut is a food, and so that triggers the FDA. The blight resistance itself is a kind of pesticide, although that's been debated in interesting ways, and so that triggers the EPA's review. And because it was transformed using agrobacterium, which is a plant pest, that triggers the USDA's oversight as well. And so all three major agencies that are involved in our coordinated framework for the regulation of biotechnology will be activated on this particular case.
Thanks, Jason. And then just so a little added thing that's timely, we don't know how the COVID-19 quarantines will affect this, but I know that there's an application into the USDA for the public comment period to open up. We had originally thought that might open up maybe March, April timeframe. It may now be delayed, but TACF is working really closely with the researchers at ESF and other folks to ensure that we spread the word about that public comment period. If you want to know when that opens up and get more information about that, please subscribe to the TACF newsletter called the eSprout. If you go to acf.org, scroll all the way to the bottom, type in your email address, you'll get an alert for that when that happens. But that's an integral part of that process, Jason, of that, the regulatory bodies want public comment. They want to know what people are thinking. And it's been an interesting process for us to go through to be a part of that.
Absolutely. And I would just say that, I would encourage, all of you and anyone who's interested to participate in that public comment period. From my own perspective, as a social scientist who thinks about emerging technologies and governance, those public comment periods are really limited in terms of who they reach. And unfortunately, they don't create any kind of meaningful dialogue between people who might think differently. And so that's a really different kind of engagement of collecting, individual opinions that are submitted in written form compared to organizing, for example, something that looks more like town hall meetings where people get to talk to each other and potentially be influenced by different viewpoints. So I do think that public comment periods are important. It's a foundation of our regulatory system to create that opportunity, but I would say it's also quite insufficient for wrestling with these kinds of topics.
Sure. Okay, I'm going to take, there's two more questions. We've got, given your rich, this is from Mark Scheel, given your rich history and experience with GMO chestnuts, when do you think GMO chestnuts would be available for the general public, or will it ever? Will there be other GMO trees released first that are not in a managed environment? So you might have addressed that yet. I don't know if you have anything additional to add.
Oh, it's a good question. And, from what I understand, there is not a biotech tree for forest health that's further along than the chestnut. I think I would know because of the kind of different committees and circles I've traveled in. One of the reasons that our National Academies Committee chose the chestnut as a case study is that it's the furthest along example of a transgenic tree for forest health. So, there actually weren't, the other case studies that I mentioned in the report about whitebark pine, blister rust, and emerald ash borer, and the poplar trees, from my understanding, there isn't advanced research on a biotech solution to the emerald ash borer. There's some work being done, but not a lot. To our knowledge, there was no research done at all around blister rust for whitebark pine and biotechnology. So the chestnut is really furthest along. And as I said before, I really can't predict when GE chestnut trees would be available to the public. But the way that our system works is that if it's an odd thing because it's not that the regulatory agencies approve it, it's that they deregulate it. So their decision to deregulate the American chestnut would then allow the genetically engineered American chestnut tree to be distributed, sold, propagated, planted. It basically becomes, an organism that is no longer under the review of our regulatory agencies. So it becomes deregulated and not approved. And when that happens, it's, at least from what we've seen in the past, it's kind of all at once. So it's not like the regulatory agencies would just approve it for release in Pennsylvania, for example, but not in New York. It would be a national level decision, and it wouldn't be specific to any type of, expert stakeholder. It would be available to the general public as soon as it's deregulated.
All right, I've got two more questions. So one, and I think this has been answered in the chat already. Carl Gallegos, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, says, has any research been done with chestnut and mycorrhizae, specifically ectomycorrhizae, to enhance growth and adaptation of this tree species? In forest genetics, we have done research to select mycorrhizae for the purpose of enhancing growth and adaptation. I know Lake Grabowski has answered that in the chat. I don't know that I have a whole lot to add to your question, Carl. Jason, I think that's out of the purview of this, but I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
I really don't, and I'm not an expert in that area, so I bet that that Lake is providing more expert information than I would.
Okay, and Carl, I'll get back to you with some additional links on mycorrhizal studies that have been done. The final question that I've got, and this is good, this is from Lake actually. What are some effective ways that we as individuals can start that meaningful dialogue that you mentioned regarding the public comment period?
Yes. Well, I think one of this is my own perspective, but I think the way that I think about engagement is that it's not just about persuasive talking. So when I think about engagement, it's not just about doing the kind of outreach and education and kind of marketing of a technology to try to convince other people that they should accept this new technology. When I think about engagement, I think about a chance for dialogue, and that includes listening. And so one of the things that I think is really important, even for people who are very sure that they support this tree, is to talk to others and hold meetings, with their, in their churches or with their, civic groups or different kinds of neighborhood groups, and have a conversation and be willing to listen to what are people's concerns and questions, and to really understand those and to respect those, and to find a way to put that into the conversation. I think, what we saw with GMOs in food and agriculture was we saw an industry that was very dismissive of public concerns, that kind of took the attitude of anyone who's opposed to GM food just doesn't understand it, and they're ignorant, and if they just understood the science, they'd be on our side. That hasn't worked very well. And so, for groups that are really in favor of this technology as a good solution to a real environmental problem, I think that what I would challenge you to do is to find ways to listen and to have respectful dialogue, and to not fall into the pattern that we saw the kind of biotech industry follow with GM food over the last 20 years. And I'll just add one thing on that, which is, the very short figure I put up about public attitudes toward biotechnology and trees, it shows that it's complicated. It shows that, we shouldn't enter into this conversation just assuming that, anybody who's concerned about genetically engineered baby food is going to be completely against the genetically engineered American chestnut tree. These are different kinds of products. And people do have sophisticated opinions. People may not understand the biology of DNA, but they do have preferences and perspectives on issues of naturalness and science and wildness and preservation of species and the importance of forests. And so we should invite them to participate in this discussion, and we should respect their perspectives and their values, even if they don't have the exact same kind of expertise that we do.
Great. Well, Jason, thank you so much for joining us, and I hope to have an opportunity to meet you in person at some point.
Likewise.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you.